everyone. Good afternoon. I am Jan Marshall-Dahms, the Vice President of U.S. Development with Join Mayshad. We are an ecosystem of brands for women by women, connecting women to each other and to the companies, causes, and organizations that champion equity for women professionally and personally. Today, you're watching our Diversity, Equity, Inclusion show hosted every Tuesday at 4 p.m. Please make sure to join us at joinmayshad.com to learn more about all of our upcoming content, programming, and opportunities for you too to become involved as a member. You're watching this show today, which is all about leadership, inclusion in the new world. And I invite you to type in all of your questions and comments into the chat box, and we'll get to as many as possible during our Q&A session. I'm so thrilled to be joined today by two incredible women who are exceptionally talented and bright and innovative in the fields of innovation and diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'd like to welcome Tiffany Yu. Hi, Tiffany.
Hi, thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Tiffany is the CEO and founder of Diversibility, a social enterprise to rebrand disability through the power of community. And she's also the founder of the Awesome Foundation Disability Chapter, a monthly micro-grant organization for disability projects across 8 countries. She started her career at Goldman Sachs and has worked at Bloomberg, Sean Diddy Combs, Revolt, Media and TV, and a venture-backed real estate startup. Wow, Tiffany, this is such a really cool background. I can't wait to talk to you more about it. We're also joined today by Irlana Ho. Hi, Irlana, welcome.
Hi.
Irlana is the founder and principal of Culture Pivot, a consultancy focused on global diversity and inclusion, culture transformation, and organizational effectiveness. Her experience includes working in highly competitive global industries such as aerospace, technology, and fashion retail. As a global nomad, Irlana has traveled abroad in some of the most diverse cities in Brazil, Canada, and Germany, and now resides in New Jersey. Welcome, Irlana.
Thank you.
So my first question is that, at Mayshad, we're a mix of corporate executives, entrepreneurs, and business owners. And we talk a lot about the complexity of identity and how we don't just show up as one thing. And particularly now in this moment in time where many of us are taking a step back and really going through some transformative, mass, deep reflection on who we are, who do we want to be as we grow up, and how are we going to change the world. We love to talk about our personal stories, particularly the backstories that bring us to where we are today. Tiffany, I'm wondering if you could kick us off with a bit about your own story and what leads you to what you do today and why you're so passionate about it.
Sure. So thank you again for having me, and hello to everyone watching. So I come into this work from lived experience, from personal experience. My story starts a little over 20 years ago, or 23 years ago to this year. I was involved in a car accident where my dad was driving. He unfortunately lost control of the car. He passed away, and I acquired a spinal cord injury, a type of paralysis that impacts my right arm known as a brachial plexus injury. So I think what's really interesting, or what I often tell people about, is that I have 2 what I will call disability origin stories. So the first is when I actually became disabled. And I think to your point, Jan, about talking about intersectionality, I'm the first generation daughter of an immigrant from Taiwan and a refugee from the Vietnam War. And within my family, having a death happen, having a car accident happen, having disability happen, we're all seen as shame within my family unit. And so I hid for a long time. And so fast forward, I want to say that car accident was in '97, fast forward a little over 10 years, this is where I came to the second point of my disability origin story, which is where I actually started to develop a narrative around what it meant to be disabled and what it meant to be proud of my disability identity. And, fast forward another 10 years later, now here we are. I think that all of those experiences of both acquiring a disability at a young age, experiencing childhood trauma, trying to figure out how the grieving process looked within the context of a very heavily Asian influence cultural background, and then bringing that into my work today. So a lot of what we do is, how can you bring your full self to work or whatever spaces you're showing up in? But then also, how can we make sure that you know how valid your story is and that it matters and that it needs to be heard?
Tiffany, I'm wondering, once you started to talk more about your own personal story, your own personal narrative, what did that mean for you? in the way that you started to show up differently, and ranging from how you showed up to your peers and in your personal spaces, but then also professionally? What did that mean to you?
That's a great question. So I like to talk about shame a lot. And shame festers when it is secret and silenced and rooted in judgment. And so the way that I tackle my own shame is by giving voice to the things that I think are causing those. So for me, by harboring that story for 12 years meant that there was something around my own personal narrative that I felt really nervous about. So for me, I've been using the word liberation a lot, and I want to be very delicate around that word. And what's interesting is about 2 years ago, I was in the process of helping San Francisco design this disability cultural center. And we were thinking about some words that we wanted our values to be. And someone mentioned the word liberation. And I remember hearing that word and I was like, that word just doesn't sit that well with me because it feels really political, even though one could argue that holding marginalized and oppressed identities is a political act, and identifying with them is a political act in itself. But then fast forward 2 years later, what that word means to me is, how can I just show up in the world unapologetically myself? And I feel so free. It feels so wonderful and beautiful to be able to sit in my disabled body and acknowledge I can be disabled and well. I can be disabled and employed. I can be disabled and all of these things, right? It's not a disabled but or like a XYZ in spite of, right? How can you hold these seemingly contradictory identities and embrace them? So liberation is my word of how I feel about that.
And I'm also wondering, in this, your personal liberating experience, did that then open new opportunities for you, in the sense of, once we have a tendency to hold things in, and then once letting it go causes a release then, and then it's incredible sometimes, like, what comes to us from that process. And did you find that personally for yourself as well?
For sure. That's also a great question. I guess I'll talk about two things. So one is, only my arm is paralyzed. And so I can actually pass as non-disabled in certain situations, but I carry trauma and grief and my disability with me all the time, right? I haven't overcome, we have like a obsession with overcoming culture. And I often tell people it's not overcoming, it's becoming, right? How can we embrace the things that you may not see, but that I'm carrying with me all the time? So Brene Brown, who I'm sure many people have heard of, you can watch her TED Talk, but she's kind of like this expert or a shame researcher. She does a lot of work around vulnerability. And one of the things she talks about is the power of emotional sharing or emotional writing. And so for me, by holding this story of the car accident for 12 years, when I let it out, that actually opened up pathways for me to start to think about, this isn't just a story about a young girl becoming disabled. She lost her dad, and she never gave herself space to understand what that grieving process. And so 20 years after my dad passed away, that's actually when I started really grieving and mourning and looking at what my relationship with him looked like. And so how this, I think, relates to some of our listeners on the call is, we're living in a really historic moment of civil rights and looking at the mirror at ourselves in terms of where we are in terms of our own anti-racism process. And part of, I think, the sharing process or the unlearning process for me is looking back at my own history. Let me look at all of the examples in my own history where I either saw something happen and didn't say anything, or, I'm going a little bit off tangent here, but anyway, I just think sharing and saying things out loud in community unlocks a lot of other things. And I think for those who work in corporate spaces who are watching this, my hope is, I talk a lot about psychological safety. And if I look at my own work experience and the spaces where I felt like I could really show up as myself, I was actually able to produce my best work because I felt like I wasn't walking in there trying to hide everything and then trying to do work. I was just showing up as myself and then doing my work.
Tiffany, thank you. Thank you for sharing with us. And many of the themes that you already touched upon, we're going to come back to as well. such a really impactful, empowered story. And I know that everyone listening can take so many different things away from that. Irlana, I'm wondering, in the conversations we've had so far, you have a very diverse background as well. And something in common with our founder, Neza Alaoui, as well, because she's actually from Morocco and you have ties to Morocco as well. Talk to us about, your experiences and the work that you've done, and, what does it mean right now from your lens, being here in the United States, experiencing what we're all experiencing together?
Yeah, I mean, right now it's a really important moment in history. I look at it as sort of the Great Reset. That's sort of the term that's being used right now, like the Renaissance, right? Like after the plague, back then in the Middle Ages, the Italian Renaissance started. And then, a period of light. And I sort of see the moment as being that now for America and for the entire world and all organizations. It's really a moment to look internally, to embrace our internal stories, for leaders to look at their own leadership styles, for organizations to question, how do they treat their employees? How do they provide a safe environment? An environment that's engaging, that's motivating, that's inclusive. So I really see this as a moment globally for all of us to reinvent ourselves and to really look down deep and to analyze ourselves and really look in the mirror. And I guess in terms of my background, being here in the U.S., it's really interesting because because I have family all over the world and I have ties in Morocco as well. Part of the I think what's been interesting is to see how each country is handling this crisis and how each culture, depending on what culture you're in, how they're also handling this crisis. So for certain cultures that are more individualistic, more like North American, I think Canada and the US is very, very similar because we're neighbors. I feel that the way that we handle certain parameters that, example, we talked about wearing the mask. In countries in Asia, for example, certain countries are more collective. We also had an opportunity to live in Germany, and Germany, it's all about, the collective good. And so people will tend to want to follow the rules for the better of the good, the collective good. Whereas I think it's interesting to see how here in the US and in Canada as well, we question, why do we need to wear the mask? And it's more individualistic, even from a political standpoint, how each, country handles it, whether it's in a decentralized way or a centralized way. But I think that this is really a watershed moment for all of us, for leaders to really look at themselves. And I think that leaders need to really understand that, leadership skills are changing. The skills that we need to build a better tomorrow are changing. We need more compassion. We need, whereas before it was more competitive, now we need more compassion. And we also need to be able to rally people around us and to mobilize people and to engage. But this has been a really, really interesting experience. I also have family in Brazil. So I was born in Brazil. I lived there till I was about 10 and then immigrated to Canada, had to learn a new language and, talking about owning our stories, that's really part of who I am. And that's something that I bring to my work. And it's really a frame, that I feel that it's a really a big strength. So Tiffany talked about, owning our stories, the importance of owning it. And when we own our stories, we become empowered, right? And so I think it's liberation, but it's also empowerment, and it's really, really something that's really, really important. And I think that right now that's the opportunity for all of us to sort of pause. So what's interesting is that it's sort of like now we're resetting ourselves to sort of the great reset, but it was also a great pause, because I feel like the entire world sort of stopped. It was like, to me, it was like the day the world came to a halt. That would be like the headline of the movie that we're in right now. And the sequel would be, the Great Reset. And so right now, in this moment where we're pausing, it's a great moment to sort of look at our internal stories, own them. And similar to Tiffany, having moved many times, and so we also lived in Germany. I had to hide. I felt the pressure to also hide a lot of my cultural identity, and to really try to adapt or assimilate. But when you adapt and assimilate, you give away part of yourself. And so that really then waters down your strengths. And actually many organizations force employees to assimilate as well, which then decreases employee productivity, engagement. And that's something that we all need to look at. And really, it's a time for organizations to really be able to assess themselves, assess their cultures, and really have that tough conversation. It's a time of change. And so for those of us who are not comfortable with change, we need to get comfortable with change. We need to pivot, because those that don't change will perish. It sounds kind of dire, but
well, but it's interesting, Irlana, like when you and I were first talking about the subject for this episode, you had mentioned going through the Renaissance period, right? Like, and equating it to something as material as that, right? And that was something that I hadn't even thought of either, in the sense of often we compare this moment in time to other pandemics or other, like SARS or MERS or the 2007-2008 financial collapse. But here in the US, as globally, the impact and the consequences of it have been so much more severe than any of those put together, right? And I love what you say around going through that moment of darkness and coming out of it on a different side, where so much is going to have to change. Yes. Every aspect of our lives, professionally and personally, like everything from how we shop and consume, to spend, to invest, to how we interact socially and find meaning in the world, and how we step into our own and claim our power. And particularly, I think for people of color and for women and all of the marginalized people that have been marginalized in the past, although we've seen everything that's wrong socially, culturally, politically, economically come to light because of the pandemic, it does bring so much opportunity with it. I want to go back to something that you were saying around, the different ways in which inclusion and just the notion of the other is going to have to change within the workplace. And I'm wondering that if this moment in time, and cultural assimilation, like how companies, once they have that corporate brand in place, it's best for you to assimilate to that corporate brand. And we know that employers and HR managers and directors will often hire for culture fit above and beyond skill fit sometimes, right? And that's whether or not the legality of that can become very, very gray and very kind of shady sometimes, right? But we know that companies do hire for organizational fit. I'm wondering now that as we go forward, while we're in this remote work period, and let's face it, many of us will be remote working for quite some time, if not maybe going into a physical office just maybe a couple of days a week instead of full time, does that offer employers and leaders a different way to think about who comes to the table when we may be coming around the Zoom room table for quite a while? Does that offer kind of a opportunity in a moment in time to level the playing field a bit? And Irlana and Tiffany would like to get both of your insights on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely think that right now it's a time of reinvention, of the workplace. The workplace will not look the same as it did, a couple of months ago. It's that's the reality. And so I think that the way that we treat diversity and inclusion, and in the way that we nurture a culture, will have to change as well. And so that means that no longer will you, for example, one very concrete example is if you're used to physically going to a particular team of people because they're physically there, they're no longer there. And so it's, as a leader, how do you then expand your circle, right? And make sure that you actually use all of your talent that's around you. And it's going to have to be a period of reinventing how you organize your teams. How do you actually train them differently? And how do you leverage the diversity of your teams as well? And then how do you also think about assembling a team that's diverse? This is the opportunity, the opportunity to actually reset and to build teams differently and to manage them differently.
I guess I'll say three things in response. So the first is kind of a little exercise. I want all of you guys to cross your arms. And then I want you to switch the arms. So that's kind of what we're experiencing right now, because it feels uncomfortable when you cross your arms and it's not the normal way you do it, right? And so it's okay to sit in a place of discomfort. And I think one of the things that this whole period is making me think about with regard to my previous work experiences is just the fact that I exist with a physical disability makes people who are non-disabled uncomfortable, because it shows you could be this. And I never want to use fear tactics because I am very proud of my identity, but I know that I wasn't born with this. And as we get older, our bodies may change as well. So it's just, yeah, I think about kind of the, some people call it locker room talk, or what happens by the water cooler, right? And if my elephant in the room is the fact that you may feel uncomfortable with my disabled arm, but don't know how to talk to me about it. This is why I'm so vocal about it, because let me invite you into the conversation so we can have the discussion that way. But number one is, yeah, getting comfortable with being uncomfortable. Then the second is, one of the great things I think about moving to the Zoom room or virtual environment is the fact that all of us have accommodations now, right? Some of us may have toddlers at home. Some of us may have roommates or partners who are also on calls in the other room, and we need to coordinate times. And at least with my disability hat on, I just love the fact that now we ask everyone what kind of accommodations they need before a video call. And as a result, if I have specific access, disability related needs, I can vocalize those, and I don't feel like I'm asking for some kind of special permission. Mm-hmm. And then the last thing I'll say is that I had a conversation with another DEI practitioner the other day, and she was talking about how Zoom and video calls have kind of become a little bit of an equalizer. And it made me think back to when I was an analyst at Goldman Sachs, and we had a meeting where I sat in the room and what I said, right? I would sit in the corner, not at the main table, and I would just be taking notes. It would almost be like I needed to be there, but no one would really notice that I was there. Versus now, everyone is the same rectangle. And I think that provides a really great opportunity for people to know that they have a voice in those spaces, or hopefully are invited to know that they have a voice in those spaces.
Mm-hmm. It's so interesting. I think that, this is literally like our business card now literally is that Zoom square, right? And we actually get to peer into the lives of people who we may never have had a personal conversation with. And I think that there's a lot of value for just giving people more freedom to feel that they can actually participate in a conversation now as well. Irlana, I think you were going to say something.
Yeah, I think that, it definitely does give an opportunity, as an equalizer. I love that, actually. It really is. But it also, takes a certain leader to be able to actually, have the right employees in those squares, right? And so that's sort of the other, and that's the work that I do, is really to look at not only the team composition, how they're composed in terms of diversity, in terms of talents, whether it be background, cognitive diversity, all of that, but also from a leadership perspective, now that we're in this virtual world, in a very unstable environment, leaders have to be able to, call on different employees, assemble different teams differently, and work differently, and really coach employees differently. So, whereas before you could have a conversation, down the hall by the water cooler with somebody, now that leader has to be able to remember to actually reach out to that individual, right? And so that can also be a challenge. And I was having a conversation as well with someone that I worked with in my last project at Airbnb. And she was mentioning that she used to have actually access to information, the informal network, a lot easier when she was actually at the headquarters. They don't have offices at Airbnb, but they have, their hot desks. But, she had her go-to people. and she was able to get information really quickly that way. And now that she's at home, that's cut off now, right, for her. And so she has to, as a leader, figure out how am I going to now get all the critical information that I need to be able to do my job better. And so I think that leadership development will change a lot. Learning and development will change a lot. How we train, no longer will we be able to bring people together physically in a room, but we will have to do, training online, which is completely different in terms of how do you transfer knowledge in that way. And definitely, Jen, you talked about hiring to fit a culture. That's actually, very contrary to diversity. So it's one of those paradoxes I find in diversity management. And that's one of the big challenges in managing diversity and inclusion and in trying to achieve, the full potential of your team, is that you're constantly managing these paradoxes. And hiring for fit is very dangerous because you can be building a very, very homogenous team in many ways, and that can decrease innovation, and it can decrease productivity and growth, really, at the end of the day. And so thinking about how do you balance the virtual world in terms of hiring, we definitely need to be more open-minded and also be less judgmental when we're interviewing them, and that could be quite I think it could be positive or negative, because how you interview somebody when you see them physically, and then through the screen is very, very different, right? And so definitely challenging times for the leader, for sure.
It's interesting because you're, in the workplace, you network up, you network down, you network across, and there are informal mechanisms of communication and as well formal communication mechanisms. And so all that's really been shifted. And you bring up such an interesting point around, like, is a leader's responsibility to make sure that now in this digital space that they're keeping in mind that even though as employees may be returning to a physical workplace, many employees will be left behind at home as well. And I'm wondering as that impacts women, because in many states and many communities, we're not necessarily sure yet if children in the fall will be homeschooled or not. Right, so there are a lot of choices that both, for those of us that are in households and are coupled, will have to make differently than, for those that, have different work configurations. And so I'm just wondering, from your perspective as well, in the sense of, how to ensure as a leader that you're being inclusive, but then also having to juggle, kind of the old world with the new world at the same time, and what kind of complexities is that going to pose, particularly for women? Because we know right now that women, all the research is showing that women are doing, the double, triple duty now at home. And it was interesting, I was speaking with one VC not too long ago who said, like, I'm a VC. I used to have an entire support mechanism around me to be able to support the work that I do. And now I feel like I've lost all the support mechanisms. I've lost the nanny, I've lost my housekeeper, I've lost, the yard people. And her husband has a 9-to-5 job where he's in his home office. She's like, I'm homeschooling kids for 6 hours a day. I have really no time for my career right now. Right. And so we see this mass transformation for women, and for women, it's hitting them hard in the sense of coming to terms with who they are and their own relationship to their own identity.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. I think that the challenge for women is definitely multiplied with the kids being at home and being able to balance. And so leaders and organizations and employers, they must look at that and be able to introduce different ways of scheduling more flexibility into the work that they do, and also not penalizing them for that, right? And so if you look at other countries, like Germany, for example, even women on maternity leave, maternity leave is 3 years, and then coming back, into the workforce, they're able to stagger it. So that's one example of an more innovative type of return to work scenario where you can come in, on a part-time basis for a number of years. And then there's also job sharing, right? How do you, job sharing is something that we haven't really looked at in the US much, because it is costly in many ways. You're sort of taking, a head count and splitting into two. There are many complexities around how do you implement that. But I think that as we move forward and this reality, like it or not, I don't think we're going back to the way it was before, right? Unless there is some miracle cure or a vaccine. I think that we definitely need to reinvent schedules. How do we schedule people's work? What are some of the support systems that we can provide as well to women so that they're able to balance the two? Because like it or not, it's the women that are going to be taking on more and more of those, activities. And I definitely can totally relate to all that. My day is, I feel like it's not 24 hours, it's longer than that. It feels that way. And I'm nonstop. One moment I'm in front of a computer, doing a webinar like this one, and then next moment I'm cooking, and cleaning and having to entertain my kids, and all of that. So it's definitely challenging for women. So the challenge, it's now is the time for organizations to really look at the way that they organize their work, make sure that they do not penalize groups that have challenges, and really be able to put in place support and really, start to really explore the different innovative ways of scheduling work, like job sharing, part-time work, and even providing some child support, daycare, maybe virtual daycare, some resources, but this is the time to innovate. We no longer can look at the traditional ways of doing.
That's great. I'll just add a point here. I hear a little bit of an echo. But the first thing I'll say is that the word I'm thinking about now is intention. So we're talking about how we're kind of losing water cooler talk or walking down the hallway. And so leaders and managers now need to be intentional around how they're reaching out to their team members or checking in. And Irlana, I think to your point, in a way, it's like the Zoom conference call is an equalizer because you're the same rectangle, but you can also be invisible. You can also choose to just mute yourself and turn your video off and kind of just having it running in the background. And so the reason why I think about this word intentional, and I use this a lot in my disability work, so I'll use it also with regard to women, is that inclusion needs to be intentional. How we think about checking in with people right now needs to be intentional. Even when we were back in office spaces, that needs to be intentional as well. And so as we think about whatever the workplace looks like in the future, if it's more of this, then one thing that we need to do is just make sure that whatever solutions we design are women-centered. So how can we have more women helping design these flexible work schedules or these job sharings or part-time work?
Yes, that's a really, really great question. But I think that it's also, going back to how I think it's more than just looking at your team right now and tactically, operationally seeing how can I do things better, right, with my team. I think it's also going back to looking at your business or your organization and really examining, am I pivoting my entire business? Because, like it or not, there are many industries out there as well that are re-questioning, they're even whether or not they're going to be existing, right? And so I think it's having to go back and re-looking at, what products and services and offerings am I offering? And I think that that's even relevant to the nonprofit space as well. All types of even institutions. We're seeing now, for example, the police force, they need to sort of go back as well and, reinvent the way that they deliver their offerings to their stakeholders. And so I think it starts from there. It starts really high level, examining your entire organization, your strategy, how am I going to deliver these offerings? Are they going to be the same, or are they maybe new offerings? And then from there, then deciding, well, then how can I now reorganize my organizations within to deliver those offerings. And so, for example, maybe before it was more decentralized. Now maybe I need to be more centralized. And maybe before, I had teams that were 100% remote, and maybe they can remain. And so that means that then we must go back and have leaders look at the way that they engage their work, their teams virtually. How can we improve the way that we deliver work to the employees, and then how can they lead their teams better in that way? I think that it really goes back to re-questioning your entire organization and what you do and the purpose. And I think that this is the time to do that. And it's sort of Simon Sinek's book, going back to why, starting with the why. It's really, really important right now to really pivot your organization and really, think about why you're doing it. And then at the same time, this is an opportunity to redesign the workplace and create workplaces that are more agile, resilient, and also, more inclusive. And virtual work, having employees that are working virtually, that's definitely a challenge. And, leaders will have to manage differently for sure. It'll take different skills for sure.
Let's talk a bit about traditional DEI initiatives. And given now that we're in this moment in time of mass transformation, much of the work that we did in the past and in conversations with other women in the DEI space, we realized that so much of the work that was very well intentioned often reified the silos that the work was trying to break down. Right, everything from sticking people into ERG groups, employee resource groups, to doing things to check things off of a box rather than putting the DEI strategies within the larger strategy of the business model itself. Let's talk a bit about your experiences in those spaces as well, and think through in this moment in time, what could innovation in that space look like?
I think for sure that the next level of conversation in terms of DEI has to be culture transformation. Traditionally, DEI has been about these initiatives checking the box. A lot of it is compliance driven, and we design metrics around, mostly compliance driven initiatives. And so I think the next level of conversation needs to be about how do we actually, transform a culture and make it more truly inclusive, where everyone feels a sense of belonging and they can actually own their own stories and bring their authentic selves to work. And then at the same time, be able to really exert their strengths within their workplace. That's really the key, is really culture transformation. That is the next level. And then really going from inclusion to belonging. How can I create a workplace where everybody can truly belong, meaning that, they're able to bring their authentic selves to work?
It's great. I will start by saying, as one of the co-founders of Bloomberg's Employee Resource Group for People with Disabilities and their allies, there is something really powerful about affinity spaces, about having that space for the employee resource group, if it's Asian, if it's Black, women, disability, because there's a term that we use in the disability space called access intimacy. It was coined by a disability justice advocate named Mia Mingus. And access intimacy is this idea that I can show up in a space and know that I have my access needs met. If I think about other identities, access intimacy looks like being Asian and showing up in another Asian space and understanding that my parents maybe didn't grow up in the US. Maybe English isn't their first language. Maybe they're carrying some other things from wartime, as my mom did, with her into how she raised her kids. That's what access intimacy looks like with some of these other identity groups. Or what is it like having Black-centered, Black-only spaces for people to talk about what type of intergenerational trauma they're carrying with them. So I will say there is power there. What wasn't working was the one event that happened during October, which is National Disability Employment Awareness Month, right? And so I think to Irlana's point about really dismantling, if we want to use that word, really, I think taking a critical eye at what does the board composition look like? What does the top leadership team look like? There was an article that came out a couple years ago. So I worked at this company called Revolt TV. It was founded by P. Diddy. You may know him. He has a couple of different names. And the article was talking about how, or at least when I worked there, everyone in the C-suite was a person of color. And I think the article also talked about most women, everyone who was director level and above, 50% were around women. And so here was a case study of where it did work, where you prioritized diversity-centered, a diversity-centered company, and that it could be successful. I mean, you can argue there are a couple other factors involved in making that company successful. But again, it's like, do I see myself in the leadership team, right? This is what the difference of moving from inclusion to belonging looks like. Do I feel like my voice is being heard? Do I feel like there are pathways for me to being an analyst, to getting to VP, to getting to managing director level? And so if we're not taking a critical eye and holding companies, businesses accountable for actually hiring people into those spaces, then we're doing a disservice to any type of DEI work. And the last thing I do want to touch on is tokenism, right? No one wants to feel like they're a token.
Yes.
But what I tell people, so within disability, our unemployment rate hovers around 70% and has since the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990. So even with a law that prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability, and again, my work is very disability centered, you can input whatever identity you want, we are still seeing bias in the interview process. We are still seeing a lack of ability to retain disabled talent or other diverse talent. What I tell people is that the way that we change these numbers is, unfortunately, we may have to hire the disabled person, or what I will tell people is, please hire the disabled person. And that person may be a token, but they need to kick ass at their job for them to stay there, right? So even if I may have come in under a different program, the reason why you're keeping me there is because I am fully capable of doing my job. My work product is great, and I have the qualifications for the job. So, and I guess I'm a little bit controversial there, but I'm okay. I'm okay for over-indexing on hiring diverse talent. I just want to make sure that they have the skills and the environment that they need. And this, Irlana, goes to your point around making sure that managers and leaders are checking in, making sure that we have the ecosystem in place for me or whoever it is to be able to succeed.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. I think that we're at a point where we do need to do that, right? And that's why affirmative action, exists, right? We definitely, I think, need that because it's so systemically, systemic discrimination and inequality is so ingrained that we actually need affirmative action. And so if I compare Canada to the US, we have very similar issues. However, inequality is probably less. And we actually don't have in Canada affirmative action. We have employment equity where we look at numbers. So companies, organizations are required to report numbers. And if nobody, makes a complaint, you're okay, right? And but the mechanism is there for you to at least just report your numbers. Whereas like in the US, it's affirmative action, meaning it's almost, what I'm going to say is controversial. It's almost like reverse discrimination in a way, if you're just looking at numbers, right? But it's not reverse discrimination if the person has the necessary skills for the job and that you're comparing, two equally qualified people and that you're not using their race or their background as, as a base, the only criteria to hire that person. So I think it's a really, really tricky, the whole, I think, affirmative action and space is really, really hard to manage, for organizations. That being said, I believe that we still need that here in the US in this context, but companies and leaders, we definitely have a lot of work to do in terms of retaining them. So if you look at some of the statistics out there, I agree with you that, once we get them into the door, there is actually some studies that show that there's a higher turnover rate in some of the minority groups, right? In certain, and depending on what the company is. But I definitely think that, the key is really to make sure that the workforce that we have in place and the culture really embraces the diversity, and really make sure that, the team that you're assembling is really diverse in all ways, not just on the cultural side, but also cognitive diversity. Make sure that we have people of different ages, different backgrounds, and even, looking at disciplines, we need to have teams that are multidisciplinary, so that you can have different ideas at the table. And so that's something that will definitely remain a challenge. But I think the next level of conversation is truly, how do we create a culture around that? And then eventually, once you create the culture, then, your hiring practices, your all of the other initiatives that you do will go around that. And the other thing too is that there are many of these DEI practices, like affinity groups, for example, work to almost divide. And so it's really, it's sort of a paradox. I think that diversity and inclusion is really being able to manage that paradox, because I have seen in the past where certain groups will really be, and really it's the key is, how do you manage those affinity groups, right? And so I've seen in the past in an organization that I worked in, I won't name the name, but where a particular affinity group became more negative in the way that the discussions that they were engaged in. And so it really became not a group where people came out of it feeling empowered, but they actually came out of it feeling worse. And so I think that, if you're going to implement employee resource groups, you definitely need to have really, really clear guidelines, and you really have to be clear about what result you're trying to create. So same thing on the hiring piece, definitely have to be very, very stringent on how you're hiring people, and be able to really have a mechanism to evaluate and make sure that you're not being discriminatory in any way in the way that you hire. And so really some of these initiatives, although well-intentioned, might not produce the end result that you want. And so the next level of conversation really is to look at really taking out a lot of the business practices and initiatives that are ethnocentric. So ethnocentrism is when you look at another group of individuals and you think that they're not as good or inferior to another. And so our entire world actually is built on ethnocentrism, right? And this is how we've justified many wars, atrocities, systemic discrimination, systemic inequality. There's many examples, but I won't go into that. But in businesses, that is something that we need to take out. And so affinity groups, for example, is something that can be very empowering, but it can also be detrimental if they take on an ethnocentric sort of culture within that particular group, where they look at themselves as being better than others, or worse, they feel that they're inferior, there's something wrong with them, and so this is why they're in a group. It's like it becomes sort of like a support group, right?
I'm wondering, I'm wondering in this moment in time too, that we think of identity often in binary constructs, right? Like you're either male or you're female, you're either black or you're white, you're either gay or straight, you're either abled or disabled, and you're leaving, just by those very linear ways in which we often judge and classify and people in boxes, we're leaving out so many other people, obviously, as we think about race, class, gender, sexuality, nationality, age, but then we're also not really fully appreciating the complexity that diversity actually brings to the table as well. And I'm wondering in this moment, and this, I think from a the way in which many perceive sexuality to be fluid, for example, or gender to be fluid, that those conversations and appreciation and tolerance and understanding and empathy was changing pre-COVID. But now that we're here, because of everything else that's happened because of the pandemic, things seem to be changing even at a faster pace, maybe. And wanted to get your perspectives on what is it going to take for leaders to show up at a table, understanding that, there's a tremendous value from a profitability perspective, from a human rights perspective, from just a humanity perspective of having people sit across the table from you who don't look like you. And how can we start to build and expand upon how we think about moving beyond those binary constructs?
So that's a great question. I mean, I think a lot, or I've been thinking a lot. I read this book, as I'm sure many people have, called White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, and she talks about the good bad binary, right? So for me to be disabled, I sit on a good bad spectrum. Oh, disabled equals bad, right? And I think to Irlana's point about ethnocentrism, right? It's seeing some other group as better than. This is where racism, ableism, all sexism, that's where these are all rooted in. And I think that, the simple answer to this, and complex at the same time, is that we need to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. And we need to get comfortable with someone who is of a different identity coming to us and telling us that they were harmed by something leadership did. And to be able to take that feedback in, not take it as a personal attack, not having an action that I made be called racist as something that speaks to my character. Again, comes back to the good bad binary, which is how can we, and I love you said from a profitability standpoint, human rights, humanity. I think for the business leaders on the call, they care about is profitability. But I'm sure the humanity and the human rights also play into it, but it's just good for your business, especially right now. I think we are in such a heated, unique moment where we're seeing Black businesses being uplifted, people of color, employees. We're seeing a lot of amplification of voices that we haven't heard from historically or have been historically marginalized. And I think to be able to look at where we're spending our dollars, number one, where we're spending our dollars as consumers, but then within our business, again, with my disability hat on, there is research done, it's done by Accenture, that shows the business case for disability. And there is also research done by another organization called Return on Disability that shows how much discretionary income disabled people have. So anyway, what I'm just trying to say is that we have the research out there that shows that hiring for diversity, I was going to say disability, also disability, is good for your business. We just need to become more okay with being uncomfortable. And one of the things I think about with this book, White Fragility, that I read, is the fact that the author is a white woman and is able to step into spaces and have conversations because she may hold similar identities to the people that she's speaking with, right? And these conversations are rooted in trust. And so if I'm coming into a conversation, and I hold multiple oppressed identities, if I come into a conversation and I feel like I'm just there to be the Asian voice or there to be the disability voice, if I don't actually believe that who I'm speaking with is going to be taking what I'm saying into account, and I'm just there as a voice or as a talking head. And I think maybe this is where the harm of the affinity group comes in. Like, if I'm not really being heard and I'm not seeing action being taken as an employee, I'm going to feel really demoralized, right? And that's not a space of psychological safety. So yeah, a long way of saying and again, this is where this word intentional comes in, right? So how can we approach the conversation and understand that we are going to have biases going into it, but be really intentional about what we're hearing, actually listen, and then actually have an action plan for what we're going to do.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I totally agree with you. I think that you definitely need to have a strategy, an action plan. I think you need to be able to also go in and diagnose and assess and really be honest with yourself to see what's working, what's not working and be courageous enough to say, oh, well, this is not working. And so we need to really fix that. And I think that right now, a lot of leaders are perhaps under the microscope might be not comfortable with, diagnosis or with assessing, what's not working, right? We all like to think about what's working. But I think now is the time to take a look at, especially in the DEI space, what is not working? What kinds of initiatives are not working, and how can we, either eliminate them, put them in place in a better way, manage them better, or create different ways, be innovative in that space and disrupt. This is the time to really be disruptive in the DEI space. And it's a really challenging space, I think, to be in right now, because you're constantly managing paradoxes. But that's something that we need to do right now for sure.
I think it's so interesting in the sense of, our comments around needing to feel uncomfortable, like getting to the space of feeling uncomfortable, and knowing that level of uncomfortableness is going to be different for different people. I'm wondering also, as we think about, so what is the role of family, the role of our employer, the role of just society in general? And so much of what we do right now is really shaped by Amazon Prime and shaped by Hulu and Netflix, and as we think about how we're spending our free time. And I'm wondering if you could both speak to, from your perspective, the role of technology and media in possibly helping us to feel uncomfortable, in the sense of getting outside of what holds us and what holds us back from really truly being able to step into claiming the power for our own, but then also in the sense of how we start to learn about the other, right? And start to learn and have a deeper appreciation for people who don't look like us.
Mm-hmm. What the media shows us tells us what matters. And we talk a lot about representation or lack thereof. And yeah, there's so many different ways I can answer this. So interestingly enough, there has been neuroscience research done that says the best way to tackle, and it's done by a woman named Vivian Ming. I always like to attribute appropriately. And she says that the best way to tackle any type of bias is through real life continuous experiences with people who challenge your stereotypes. For me, this is at the root of what we've created at Diversibility, is how can we facilitate these once upon a time IRL in real life interactions. But this is where I find media is a little bit harmful, right? Because most narratives around disability are framing disability in terms of victim, pity, shame, or inspiration porn, which is, look at this incredible thing that this person did despite their disability. They're incredible despite their disability. And then I'm like, oh, so you are reinforcing to me, again, the good, bad binary, that my disability is bad. So all of that to say, I think media is a start. I will often tell people these days about curating your inputs. And I got that from a woman named Faye, who started something called Deliberate Discourse, which is this dinner series to talk about racism and other topics like that. So she talked about curating your inputs, and that means going to whatever your main source is. Maybe it's social media, maybe it's news, and starting to follow accounts that are of people who look different than you. Because what that is doing is it's subconsciously saying, oh, here's someone with a different body, scuba diving or doing something seemingly normal, and again, I you can tell I'm very disability centered in how I think. But if someone does want to watch a movie, Crip Camp on Netflix talks about the history, is a documentary about the history of disability rights. But right now, I think what is so interesting is we are seeing so many guides, anti-racism guides being created, right? Literally Google. What I made a joke in passing the other day, and I said the same way that, maybe we're getting ready to go on a date and we do some research on to who our date is. We'll look up their LinkedIn, or maybe that's just me. I'll look up their social media. That's the same thing we should be doing in terms of anti-racism, anti-ableism, anti-sexism work. we need to be doing that same level of research. And so there are recommendations online. The media plays a huge, again, as I started this monologue, I guess I'll call it, the media plays a huge role in how we see ourselves, right? So if I don't see myself on screen, there's a narrative that's being reinforced in my mind, whether I know it or not, that my story doesn't matter. If I read headlines that, some of the headlines I've been seeing these days are really heartbreaking. Mm-hmm. And again, it's like, even in the inspiration porn headlines, they don't even say who the name of the person is. Like, this person ran a marathon despite their cerebral palsy. I'm like, cool, I'm really inspired for a second, but what's that person's name? They are a human, right? If we want to root ourselves in humanity and human rights, I'm not just a diagnosis. That person isn't just a race. That person isn't just a gender.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Definitely, those are really excellent points. I think that media is really a reflection of culture. It goes back to culture. And so, depending on which country or, where you live, the media will reflect a certain culture. And I think that different cultures also have different ways of looking at diversity, right? And so certain cultures will maybe be more welcoming to people that are different, that look more different than us. And in certain countries or cultures, someone who comes into the culture is forced to assimilate, right? More so than in other countries. And so if I, just compare North America, definitely if I compare, for example, Canada to the US, they're definitely very similar, but maybe there is a bigger pressure in the US to try to maybe assimilate and become more, American. Whereas Canada, we normally look at Canadians pride ourselves on thinking we really don't have a Canadian identity. We are, we're a mosaic. We are multicultural, and so that's what makes Canada Canada. It's multicultural. We don't really have a Canadian identity per se. But I think that, and then going back to the role of media really reflects culture, right? It's sort of like the chicken or the egg scenario. It either can reinvent culture or it can just perpetuate, the dialogues and the narrative that's going on. And so I think that right now, the media all over the world, and depending on what no matter which country you're in, even the media needs to be able to really, communicate the message that diversity is a good thing, that we must be open to others, that media needs to be less ethnocentric. And ethnocentrism is everywhere in the media, and it's very, very subtle. Whether it be towards people of disability, people of different culture, men and women, there are different subtle messages. And I think that media, they definitely need to also, as organizations and as institutions, self-reflect on what their role is and how they can play a better and more constructive role, in society. That's kind of very controversial as well on what I just said, but definitely I think right now they need to really reinvent the way that they're communicating certain messages and really be intentional. Again, it goes back to being intentional. I love the word that you used. It's really about everybody, I think, needs to be more intentional.
I think one thing I'll add is there was a movie that came out, I think maybe a year or two ago, called The Farewell. And it starred Awkwafina, Asian American actress. And the storyline was about the grandmother getting a fatal diagnosis and no one in the family telling her. And the reason why I want to bring up The Farewell is because it's not only about what content the media is producing, it's about us consuming it. Where are we putting our dollars? And there was an initiative that happened here in the US called Gold Open, where a lot of Asian American entrepreneurs or other stakeholders who had acquired wealth throughout their career would buy out theaters because they wanted to have power as the consumers of that content to tell these media organizations what we think is important, right? And the media is going to continue making what is getting the clicks or what is getting the dollars. And then the other thing I'll say is the first time I only saw The Farewell once, but when I saw it, that was actually the first time I started thinking about what my own story looked like in an Asian cultural context. And then it made me realize, oh, no one is telling this grandmother that she's passing away in her family. Maybe this is why no one talked about death in my own family for years, right? And then I started, and it was only until I saw it on screen that I started thinking more about it and then talking to my other Asian American friends like, hey, did you see this movie? And again, it comes, this is where the affinity kind of comes in, you know, talking to other people and realizing, oh, there is something very normal. I thought it was very strange that we never talked about my dad passing away. But then I realized in the context of this ecosystem and this identity that I wear, this actually makes sense because there's some old tradition or old way of thinking that death means something. So I think the dollars, and this is why I talked about like amplifying Black businesses and people of color. It's like even the leaders of corporations who are watching this right now, as you're making statements about Black Lives Matter, as you're thinking about what services to hire for different things that you need within your company, you're making a statement wherever your dollars are going, and that's important too.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Irlana. Thank you, Tiffany. We have time for just a couple of questions from our viewers today. The first question delves into the complexities of hiring and interviewing. And we know that 48 million Americans have filed for unemployment claims during this period of time, and women are overrepresented in every single industry. And so for those women out there who are watching today, this viewer wants to understand what are some ways that now HR managers are stepping up to the plate in different ways to ensure that if you're over the age of 40, if you're not Caucasian, if you have a disability or from a different country or for whom English is not your first language, how can you ensure that you're actually coming to the table fully prepared for what lies ahead in that interview process through the recruiting process, addressing it from both sides of the table, both from the employee perspective and then from HR, from the perspective of what could HR be doing differently right now to ensure a more welcoming, tolerant interview process?
I think from an HR perspective, there definitely needs to be, make sure, the recruiters and your recruitment function, you really need to make sure that there is no unconscious bias going on there, right? So that's really, really important. Everything from, I remember years ago during recruitment, and we had a conversation in our team, and again, I won't name the organization, but we had a conversation where, the manager said, I don't want to hire this person because of, because of the last name. I don't want to, if you're going to see sort of like that kind of last name, like, I don't want to see it, right? That was the message. Of course, it wasn't said in that way. And so as recruiters, we definitely need to be aware not only of our own unconscious biases, but also be aware of your client, your internal client's biases, right? And you need to also play a role, because a lot of times in these companies, it's not just the HR manager or the recruiter that's making the decision, it's also the business leader. And HR, definitely, I've worked in it for many years as a generalist recruiter, and that is a tough job. But the role, I think, of HR, we really need to be able to coach our leaders if they do have the unconscious bias, to be able to really put in place a process that's bias-free, and make sure that you're really looking at the candidate for their strengths, their qualifications, and what they bring to the table. And that's it. And there have been studies done where the same candidate will change their name. There is a study that was done, and actually they got hired, from changing their name. So it's really, that's really important, I think, on the hiring side. very, very important. And then on the employee side, I think it's, doing all the right things in terms of highlighting your strengths, your, what you can bring to the table. I truly believe that everybody has a gift to give. You're given a gift and you have strengths. And it's almost like coming up with the I love me, list. What it is that you can bring, and really make sure that those are highlighted in your resume. And also, this is a time I would, for all everyone to really look at their careers and think about what is it that I'm truly passionate about and what is it that I truly want to do. And this is a great time for entrepreneurialism. I think that I heard on the news the other day that entrepreneurship is actually down 30% to 40% in the US versus other countries. And so there is an opportunity right now for people to even come out and reinvent themselves and become entrepreneurs. If you can't find, if you find that there are no jobs that really suit what it is that you want to do. But I think that the key is really making sure that, you look at yourself and really be true to yourself and think about what is it that you're truly passionate about, what am I good at, and really, put all those great things on a resume and when you interview.
I'll a couple things Irlana said. The first was really around understanding that you have a gift in the world. And I have a podcast. I started a podcast during this quarantine or during this pandemic. And my latest guest, her name is Emily Aries, and she's the CEO and founder of a company called Bossed Up, which is all about helping women be the bosses of their career. And she said a couple things that were interesting to me, which is if you've lost your job, of course, there's going to be grief, but take a step back, first take a breath, but then think, am I really never going to get a job again? And I actually thought that was really interesting framing because we get so caught up in this narrative of things are so bad right now, but I get the sense that people who are watching this call are really ambitious, kick-ass women, and I feel very confident. And I'm not sure if I was allowed to use that. Or effective.
You can use it as often as you want, Tiffany. As often as you want on that show.
So I just thought that the reality check of like, are you really never going to get a job again? Is this really like doom and gloom? And then again, it's like you have a gift in this world and you just need to find where that's going to land. I think on the hiring front, oftentimes I'll look back at my own career trajectory and the fact that I got an internship at Goldman, I had the opportunity to work there. That is a stamp on my resume that as a disabled person, I know not a lot of people have. And yes, you should have the processes in place to try and combat biases, but I'm going to say something a little bit radical here. But like, what if for those of you who are hiring doctors, like, what if you took a chance? What if you took a chance on that person who maybe doesn't have all the credentials? And I think what's interesting about the resume and about systemic, all the isms, is that it starts from the zip code you were born in. It starts from your education or what the school system was like there. And I grew up in Maryland, kind of close to DC. And I was in public school up until I went to college. But I was in one of the best public schools in the nation. And so even though it was public school, I felt like I got a really quality education. And I feel very grateful and privileged to my parents. I don't even know if they were thinking about that kind of stuff when they moved to Bethesda, Maryland. But growing up in Bethesda played a huge role in everything that happened. So I'm going on a little bit of a tangent there, but yeah, I think on the one hand, for those of you who are new job seekers, really, and Emily said that's my podcast because I said everything about the job search is not fun because recruiters are really right now probably being overwhelmed with applications, and so it's easier to ghost more than ever. So I said the job search, the job hunt just doesn't seem fun. And then Emily responded, she said, Tiffany, is dating fun? Because if you're only looking at the end goal, right? If I'm only going, and I feel like I've mentioned dating a couple of times on this call, but it's like, if I go into a date being like, okay, is this person going to be the one, married, where are we going to live? How's our family going to look? Like, that is not fun, right? And so instead of saying, help, 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 I need a job, please hire me, I've been applying to all these places, say, and I think Irlana talked about this too, like, do an inner survey of what are the skills I want to gain right now? Who in my network can I tap into to just reconnect with to see how things are going during this quarantine? It is very difficult. I'm going to say probably even more difficult now to just do a one-click LinkedIn apply, to just do a one-click Indeed, right? And so tap into your network, like, and trust is built through vulnerability, right? And I know a lot of us are kind of afraid of being a little bit vulnerable, but it's okay to say, hey, I am a casualty of COVID. Not in that way. Sorry. I've been furloughed due to COVID. Sorry. I feel like I worded that in a way that wasn't sensitive, but, and this is why I like entrepreneurship, because I can say whatever. But yeah, I think just getting a little bit vulnerable, reaching out to your network. Now the job search to me is really all about networking. So if you're watching this, feel free to add me on LinkedIn. Just make sure you include in the note that you watch this, and I'm happy to add you. But if there's anyone in my network, I'm happy to make a double opt-in intro. I think that relationships are now what we need to be doubling down on, especially now that we're in a virtual environment.
I would agree 2000%. And I think that also in a moment in time for us to think outside the sandbox in the sense of how we network as well. And even though most of us are still at home remote working, there are so many different opportunities to get involved and engaged in very diverse networks where you never really know who can help, right? And I think it's, taking a chance, taking a risk, sticking your toe in the water to really find those opportunities and align your networking with things that bring you pleasure, whether it's reading or cooking or wine tasting or whatever that is. All those things that we used to network around physical events are available to all of us now in the digital space as well. This has been such an incredible conversation. Irlana, Tiffany, would love to have you back sometime very, very soon, because I know that we're already over time. Thank you everyone for sticking with us and staying with us throughout the show. We had so many more questions we didn't get to, so definitely we have to do a 2.0 version of this very soon. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone. Please make sure to check us out at joinmayshad.com for all of our upcoming programs. We'd love to have you become a part of our ecosystem as well. And I'm Jan Mercer-Dahms, the Vice President of U.S. Development with Join Mayshad. Have a great week, everyone.